Welcome to the Healthy Skin Show with Jennifer Fugo, where we're flipping everything you've been told about your chronic skin issues upside down and connecting you with alternative solutions your dermatologist never told you about.
Welcome back to episode 279 of the Healthy Skin Show. In today's episode, we are going to talk about a chemical that can be found in your home, in the air outside, and now research shows that exposure to this chemical is associated with an increase in eczema. My guest today is Dr. Myles. Some of you may recognize his name because he is one of the physicians that I kind of raved about, to be honest with you, when I attended the Eczema Expo back in July of 2022. He had hosted a presentation that was jam-packed, and I would argue was probably the most popular talk of the entire event. The particular chemical that we're going to be talking about is called thiocyanates, and the research that was published on this particular chemical came out about a month ago. So this is super new, and it's a real honor to have Dr. Myles here, who's going to dive into the research that he was a part of and has been published in the journal Science Advances. As I said, my guest today is Dr. Myles. He received his medical degree from the University of Colorado and then trained in internal medicine at the Ohio State University prior to beginning fellowship training in allergy and clinical immunology at the NIH. He became a commissioned officer in the United States Public Health Service Commissioned Corps and has supported several U.S. and international missions. Dr. Myles received his master's in public health from George Washington University before becoming the head of the Epithelial Therapeutics Unit to evaluate the efficacy and safety of a topical live bacterial treatment for eczema. And just so you guys know, I love how Dr. Myles thinks. He thinks outside of the box, and I really, truly love that. And I know that you are going to love what he has to share with us today. I know that you care about the air quality in your home just as much as you probably worry about having clean water to drink and what's in your cleaning products. Plus, research shows that air quality in your home may impact chronic skin conditions. And what I'm talking about goes beyond just allergens, my friends. We're talking about air pollution and even chemical off-gassing that comes from seemingly harmless things like your furniture, paint, flooring, carpeting, and more. I've been repeatedly asked over the past few years for a recommendation on an air filtration system, and after doing a lot of research, I believe that an Air Doctor Pro unit is the way to go. What I love about their units is that they have a filtration system consisting of an ultra HEPA filter that can remove particles that are 100 times smaller than the HEPA standard filter, as well as a dual-action carbon gas trap VOC filter that removes odors, ozone, gases, and volatile organic compounds like formaldehyde. The Air Doctor units quietly work to purify the air as well as add negative ions into your environment. Plus, it has been shown to remove 99.99% of a range of bacteria and viruses, including Staph aureus, SARS-CoV-2, H1N1, influenza A, Candida albicans, and a list of other organisms. And it's been a huge improvement to our home air quality since we have 3 crazy cats that love to shed and get into everything. I love my Air Doctor Pro, and I know that you will too. To learn more, head to airdoctorpro.com/healthy skin show to check out the different units available and get a nice discount on your purchase. So without further ado, let's dive into today's conversation. Dr. Myles, thank you so much for being here on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invite.
So do you want to share with listeners what your background is? I know many of them heard me speak about you when I went to the Eczema Expo, and many people wanted to know more about your presentation. But could you share a little bit about your background? Because you're not like the standard dermatologist that I've had on as a guest in the past.
Well, yeah, I'm not a dermatologist at all. I'm an allergy immunology researcher. So I grew up in Colorado, went to school, med school there, did internal medicine training at the Ohio State Medical Center, and then came to NIH to be an allergy immunology fellow, and have stuck around ever since.
And what do you think in terms of like a lot of these different diseases with the skin, just from your perspective, do you think that at this point in time, do you feel like there's a lot more to what's driving these issues than perhaps, you go to the doctor and they might tell you, oh, you have an allergy to laundry detergent and here's a steroid cream and here's this medication. Do you feel like there's a lot to this that we're still researching and figuring out?
Yeah, I think a lot of the questions, so as an immunology specialist, right? So we're talking about the immune system in the entire body. You start to ask the question, is this an systemic disorder, the entire body, that primarily manifests in the skin, or is this a skin disorder? And there are examples of both, but the more you kind of think, okay, this is a full body, the whole system's involved, everything is going wrong, then that is going to take a different approach and a different solution than, okay, we'll just deactivate the immune system in your skin using this steroid, or simply avoid X and then you'll be fine. So I think, yes, I definitely think that we're learning that these diseases involve other parts of the body, particularly the gut, for example, and that therefore they're going to require a little bit more sophisticated response than just topical or even drugs that only target one particular receptor, that kind of thing.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the gut, and that was something in your presentation that I appreciated because you were really jumping around and connecting a lot of different dots that sometimes can be difficult to ascertain just from reading articles. So in terms of let's just say eczema, for example, and obviously there's cytokines associated with psoriasis as well. Do you think, in your experience as an immunologist, it's possible that those cytokines that these various drugs target could actually be generated from something possibly happening in the GI tract?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you want to define that. But if you're saying the first domino that falls in the GI tract, and then that leads to too much, particular cytokine somewhere else in the body, absolutely. I think at this point, it'd be hard to even argue against that. The types of bacteria that live in your gut, you have to have them to train the immune system to function properly, right? The immune system has basic tenets are, you find something that doesn't belong here, let's destroy it, and then, okay, let's all quiet down and get everything back in order, and then let's put everything back the way it was, right? Those are kind of the stages of this: induce inflammation, kill the thing off, and then put everything back the way it was, so that we don't leave damage behind. Every cell that does that, you have to have an organism in your gut to kind of prime the immune system to figure out how that works. So if you can grow a mouse in a lab with no gut bacteria, every aspect of its immune system does not function properly. And so I think that it's really unquestionable that, you need the gut microbiome to kind of prime the immune system in a lot of ways. And if that gets thrown off, which is a lot easier to do, of diet and antibiotics and other things you might consume, then yes, I do think that the subsequent downstream effect could be disrupting a cytokine on the skin, far away from the gut.
This episode is brought to you by my line of professional grade supplements called NutriQuel. I crafted these supplements especially for those struggling with chronic skin rash issues and based the formulations on my extensive research and clinical experience in my private practice. They are made from the highest quality ingredients and tested to be free of different allergens so that you can support your gut, liver, and overall health with the formulas that I've found work best for my Skin Rash Warrior clients without triggering a flare. I'm excited to share them with you, so check them out at quellshop.com and use the coupon code GET15OFF to get 15% off your first order. I'll put a link in the description below. And now let's jump back to the video. Do you think that, and this is just my curiosity, do you think that if there are alterations within the gut microbiome, could there be possibly a connection with dysbiosis of the skin's microbiome?
Yes, and that too. There are more, so that can be shown pretty straightforward but more extreme examples, right? So people who have genetic mutations that just just completely ruin some part of their immune system. That's obviously a little bit subtly different than what we're talking about. But yeah, the bacteria in the gut, those cells that get trained by the bacteria in the gut pack up and then go to live in the skin. And that's their job, right? They go live in the skin and then they go protect the skin. And if they're trained improperly in the gut, then when they go to the skin, they don't function properly. So that's pretty clear. Something called Omenn syndrome, OMENN, if people want to look it up. But that's a different universe than what you're talking about. But so the short answer is just absolutely that, those things that disturb the gut will alter the cellular response of the skin.
Yeah. And one thing that you shared that was really eye-opening to me was this connection between an eczema flare versus the amount of Staph aureus on the skin. Do you think that maybe, because here's the challenge, is that I have a lot of listeners and whatnot who will go to their doctor, they're in this horrific flare, they have the symptoms of an infection, and their doctor will literally tell them that everybody has staph and just blow them off and send them home with more steroids, unfortunately. This isn't an uncommon experience for many of my listeners. Do you think that we need to rethink that maybe in considering the whole role of Staph aureus and how it can impact eczema and its severity?
Yes and no. So I think the standard academic answer, there's a field, a subset of the field that really thinks Staph aureus is the cause. It just everything, you get Staph aureus and then that generates a flare. The problem with that, as we discussed at the meeting, was eczema is unquestionably not contagious. There's mountains of epidemiologic data. It is not a contagious entity. And so because of that tells you that staph could certainly make things worse, but it can't be the primary cause. In terms of, okay, well, what do I do then to treat it? If somebody comes in with overt infection, so cellulitis and things that really scream this is infected tissue, then definitely antibiotics would be appropriate at that point. But all of the studies have really been fairly clear that if all you do is kill off the Staph aureus, that's not going to help in the long run. So just taking topical antibiotics or oral antibiotics flat out doesn't work. And so if you have a treatment where the only thing you think it's doing is killing Staph aureus, in the long run, is not going to be net beneficial. So I mean, it's hard without seeing the actual patient to say should Sure. they have gotten it because it was a real infection or not. But I would just say short of overt infection, then you shouldn't treat. And I think the rethinking is, Staph aureus, what it's really good at is jumping into inflamed tissue and taking hold and then making things worse, right? It's an invasive species, but it requires you to kind of till the soil for it, to kind of give it a disrupted environment to thrive. And then when you if you can fix that environment, Staph aureus doesn't really survive very well, which is why injectable drugs that have nothing to do with staph can actually get the Staph aureus to go away, because you're curing the skin and now the staph has nowhere to live. So now the question really should be not, okay, we get why the staph showed up and created a problem. Well, why did the staph have an opportunity? What really threw off the skin that then allowed the staph to step in there and make everything worse? And those kind of the deeper questions.
And that's kind of where your talk, which was wildly popular, when I was in your first session and all the seats were filled, and then people were coming in for the next section. And I just remember everyone just kept having more and more questions. And I think that this underscores the point of what you were talking about, is that there may be environmental factors that we're not really considering at this current moment. So for example, you had mentioned something about fabrics, and fabrics can impact your skin. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the the fabrics are one aspect. So specifically to answer that one, patients, it has been published that it's pretty clear, do not respond well. Atopic derm patients do not respond well to spandex, nylon, and polyester. They will just, and then super itchy wool sweaters, but who's wearing that in this day and age, right? But, you'll avoid those. And the original thought was, well, spandex and nylon tend to be tight. And so maybe it's just too restrictive and, it's too occluding, which is a little odd because, the whole point of slathering yourself with ointments and the lotions is supposed to help you to make it more occlusive. But of course, that wouldn't really explain polyester. Why, like a polyester shirt that isn't tight or isn't, it's loose fitting, why do patients tend to tell, the interviewers, their doctors, whatever, I can't tolerate this. I need the cotton and I'm fine with cotton. And so that's part of it, that, this kind of like, well, what is going on here? And then, our work really started with the observation that atopic derm has, in all allergic diseases, have really exploded in their prevalence since about 1970 or so. And it's not because suddenly we got better at diagnosing atopic derm. When you see a big explosion of disease, it either means it's real or that like a new detection tool was invented or something like that, right? Or that we were missing it before. But it's pretty clear that it's real. There's a large increase. I think most of your listeners would probably appreciate food allergies as one, right? Like none of your grandparents went to a peanut-free school, but anybody who's listening probably sends your kid to at least a peanut-aware school. So we know that these things are increasing. And so that was part of our question, is like, well, why all of a sudden now is, so many more kids developing eczema? And then I think tied to that, whether we appreciated it at the time or not, is that the parents and the patients are saying what's driving them quite crazy. One of their biggest questions is, why am I having a flare today, right? Like, I'm doing everything else the same. I'm eating the same. I'm taking my meds. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I didn't do anything different. And today I decided to flare, right? And that's the part that can be very frustrating, is to try to nail down what these real triggers are. And so those two questions, I think, led us down kind of the environmental path. And the fabrics became part of that. Like, okay, and we started to examine what other things have patients said, are inducing a flare, or epidemiology has said, right? And, you see unhealthy diet practices. So processed foods are associated with an increased risk. Early life antibiotics, increased risk. Again, those kind of speak to that gut microbiome aspect. But like living near a highway was a strong increased risk for eczema, atopic derm. Wildfires is probably the more recently appreciated one, particularly Australia and California. Those wildfires kick off and you start to actually watch flares radiate out from those sources. So nylon, spandex, and polyester as the fabrics. In-home products that are associated with increased risk are anything that you'd basically think of renovating a nursery before the age of 2. So paint, polyurethanes, stains, sealants on wood sealant, wallpaper glue particularly, new carpeting. These are things that are all associated with increased risk. And so on face, it's hard to explain that, because you'd say, all right, maybe that's just a marker of being rich, right? That you're wealthy enough to renovate your whole home for the new baby versus not. But even controlling for income, that still ended up being the case. And so that's where we were when we started our environmental survey, to just say, okay, there's a lot of things that none of them feel connected. Like, why would carpeting and polyester shirts both have a problem, and wildfires? But we kind of felt like, our investigation kind of led us to particular chemicals that are shared in all of those exposures.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you specifically, let's hope I don't butcher this, diisocyanate. I think I got it.
There you go.
It's a bit of a mouthful, and I'm sure listeners are like, I have never heard of that before. So what is that?
Yeah, so the first time I had ever heard of it is after we had 2 different databases. So one is clinic visits for eczema or atopic derm. So we asked basically per capita, right? So it's not, obviously there's more eczema visits in Manhattan than there is in the middle of a rural town. But per person, which areas, which zip codes are seeing more eczema than you would anticipate or less. And then the second database comes from the EPA, and they are two different sets of databases that basically say, if you burn a big ton of whatever out front, you have to tell the EPA, hey, by the way, I released this much this year. Or if you dump stuff into the river, you have to tell them. And there's like 500 chemicals on that list. So what we're basically asking is, which chemicals seem to show up in the zip codes that have more eczema than you would anticipate, right? And so the med student in the lab, Jordan Zeldin, he put together these mathematical models, and diisocyanates was basically the top. So it was the only thing more predictive of whether or not you would have a clinic visit for atopic derm was how many pediatricians, allergists, and dermatologists basically live in your town, which makes sense, right? You're not going to see the doctor if there's no doctors living in your zip code. So diisocyanates was far and away the number one chemical, and I had never heard of that in my life. So I start researching it, and diisocyanates is a chemical that came on the market, became manufactured in the United States starting in 1970, and has basically slowly increased ever since. For what it's normally manufactured for are wallpaper glue, polyester, polyurethane, spandex, nylon, all of these different chemical exposures and these environmental exposures require diisocyanates for their construction. Not to get too heavy into the chemistry, but diisocyanates have a side group called isocyanates. So diisocyanates means the molecule has two of them, so isocyanate is just one. If you want to say, well, where would you come across isocyanates? Isocyanates come out of car exhaust. So living next to a highway would increase your exposure to isocyanates, but only if you burn it through a catalytic converter. So normal gasoline does not cause increase in isocyanates. It causes an increase of a lot of other horrible things that'll kill us in other ways. But having a catalytic converter, suddenly now you get an increase in isocyanates. And that became mandatory in the United States in 1975. The other sources of isocyanates would be cigarette smoke, which is strongly associated with increased risk of eczema. And the only natural source of isocyanates that exists that is known are wildfires. And so it just seemed like every, box started to be ticked. If you're like, why would wallpaper? Well, it turns out wallpaper glue is made out of diisocyanates. Well, what about, spandex, nylon, polyester, all made out of diisocyanates. I told you things really start kicking off in the 70s, which screams out that something entered the market in the 70s to drive some of this. Well, suddenly it starts to become manufactured in the 70s. It starts getting into people's homes in the 70s. Foam mattresses, I left that one off the list. Those are made out of isocyanates. And then it started to become part of car exhaust in 1975. So you start putting these things all together, and it really screamed out, oh man, this seems concerning that when we just were, randomly looking, hey, are there any chemicals associated with atopic derm? The one that comes back is in every one of these products. And then what that really made it concerning was that when you want to, any drug, and it doesn't matter what pharmaceutical you can name, at some point in its development, gave a mouse eczema using a chemical, and then used their drug to take the eczema away, right? And then they went to the FDA to say, hey, look, it works, maybe we should try it in people. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but every successful drug did that at some point. The only 7 chemicals you can use to give a mouse eczema so that you can then treat it. 2 of them are diisocyanates. So it just became overwhelmingly concerning that you say, if I wanted to give a mouse eczema, I would use the one chemical that I happen to find most associated with human eczema, and that is across all the epidemiologic risk factors and correlates in time and space and risk factors. So that's really made us start thinking, all right, this could be a problem. And then from there, we try to figure out why it's creating the problem. What is it doing that's then creating these problems?
Yeah, because I was wondering, I'm thinking to myself as you're going through this list, obviously with wildfires and exhaust, it's in the air, and obviously could be coming in contact with the skin physically, but you're also inhaling that. And so for example, you mentioned wallpaper glue. Is it that it off-gases the chemical?
Yes, it off-gases. And so what we did is I literally just went to a hardware store and started buying all this stuff. And then would put it in the lab and put it next to one of these monitors to measure. So it's a monitor that measures diisocyanates, and would pick up these diisocyanates coming off of drying wallpaper glue or drying polyurethane glues, anything like that. And so, yeah, I think there's off-gassing. Diisocyanates are pretty well known in terms of occupational asthma. So that would be inhaling it, generating a response, and then every time you inhale it after that, you get asthma. That has been really well researched, and the exposure level you need to induce kind of pulmonary response is pretty high. And I mean high in terms of, I wouldn't think wallpapering your house would be enough to do it. It's kind of more the guys in the factories who are manufacturing this, and that's, when you manufacture it, it's head to toe covers, it's the big gas mask, those kinds of things. So I think the lungs are lungs damage needs higher doses. But yes, I do think in the air is where the problem is.
Well, and when you talk about the fabric, so how, and you may not know the answer to this, but like any thoughts on how like nylon or spandex or polyester, like it's part of that, it's on your skin. Is it that it's like an irritant? Does it get absorbed into the skin?
So yeah, I think so. When we were looking at what we think is going on, it's basically two tracks. So the first one goes to the microbiome that lives on the skin. So all the microbiome, I'm sure it's more complicated in terms of what you need the skin microbiome to do. There's lots of things, but one of the big ones is it makes oils. I'll use the word lipids, but that's the kind of like they make these lipids that your skin needs in order to be healthy. That without them, you're not going to have good barrier function, and the immune system's not going to work right. And so these bacteria help make some of that for you. And isocyanates, in short, prevent that bacteria from being able to do that. Now we work on a bacteria called Roseomonas mucosa. We also tested Staph epidermidis and Staph coni, which are coag-negative staphs. And what's interesting is Staph aureus isn't affected at all. So when you expose Staph aureus to diisocyanates, it has learned tricks to protect itself from that. Not because of that, I think, but learned tricks for other reasons that it now uses to protect itself against diisocyanates. And in our bacteria, when we expose them, the bacteria that survive develop those tricks, and they start to use that. And so basically, your good bacteria on your skin either die or change their physiology in such a way that they're no longer functioning in a beneficial way anymore. Like in order for that bacteria to survive, it has to change so it's no longer helping you do the things that you needed. So that was one major pathway in terms of it's poisoning your bacteria, preventing it from making the lipids that you need in a beneficial way. The second one is that there are receptors on your skin that they pick up hot and cold. Now, everybody knows the one is called TRPV1, whether you know it or not. It's the reason why chilies taste hot. So there's a receptor that's supposed to be hot, and then the chilies hijack it and make you think that it's hot, right? Well, there's one called TRPA1, and that's supposed to be for cold. And diisocyanates, a particular one called toluene diisocyanate, or TDI, the most common one in products, that is directly activated by this chemical. And when you activate TRPA1, there's a signal that goes to the brain that says, we need to scratch this off of me. Like there's a signal for itch. And then the signal that comes back is pain and rash. And so
wow.
And while it's in the brain, it actually processes through the anxiety and depression centers, at least in mice. And so what you've got is you got a chemical that will poison your skin bacteria to keep them from doing what they're supposed to do, and then activate a receptor in your skin that will immediately induce itch, rash, and in psychological stress, at least. And so that's what I think, those are the two things going on. So in terms of the fabrics, I think laying that chemical up against your skin, or particularly like polyester bed sheets, I would worry about for children. If they're laying on that chemical is touching the skin, it's going to disrupt the bacteria's ability to do its job, and it's going to directly activate the defects in the skin, and so where the receptors in the skin. And so what we need to do now is really start connecting, like, well, how much can you expect in a house? What's the normal day-to-day fluctuation of this stuff? How much is too much for the skin? Those kinds of questions are what's outstanding.
Yeah, because I'm thinking for someone who's like a mom dealing with a child with eczema and listening to this going, oh my gosh, what do I do? I mean, I don't know if you have, I mean, I think obviously you've stated like you've got to make some choices in fabrics and different household things. Is there any, I mean, obviously you can't get a device that's just going to suck up this chemical from the air. Is there any potential remedy or actions that someone could take to possibly reduce their exposure?
Yes, I would definitely spandex, nylon, polyester to stay away from. I would not get a foam, like those memory foam mattress, get like a more traditional cotton type thing. I wouldn't paint polyurethane, wallpaper. If you're listening to this and you had plans to like remodel your baby's nursery, don't. The baby's not going to notice. I would stay away from those. But one of the worries is that the exposures that matter for eczema happen before you're 2, maybe before you're 4 is more of a gray zone. So if you're the parent whose kid's already 6 or 7 has been dealing with this, I don't know that avoidance at that point's gonna be the cure-all, but it's worth a shot. I would say we did test the ability of just your routine air filter to kind of pull this out. I should call it routine, but it's like the carbon. They all sell something, but it'll label for like VOCs. That'll be the volatile organic compounds. And so we were able to pull a pretty good amount out of a control room. Like we put a room and filled it with this stuff, and we could pull it down to 0 on the monitor. But it's not low enough for the bacteria to be okay. So my take home on that is, if you can get an air filter, I think there are studies, actually only 2, but somebody did use air filters for eczema and could see an improvement. It's just hard because there's no placebo control. How would you fake an air filter?
Right.
But there's some evidence that at least, and I can't imagine it's going to hurt, right? So other than the financial bite it might take, but if you try that, what we're trying to do next is validate a air filter that really can suck this all out, because there may be one, right? There may be some particular filter that really could completely eliminate this from the air at least in your home, right? You're not going to be able to do much probably when you're out and about. But if we can validate our kind of detection system, now we can tell you, okay, these filters will actually get things down to 0 and these ones won't.
Yeah. And so I just want to ask one quick question. So the VOCs that you mentioned, so the diisocyanate, is that a VOC?
Technically,
Okay.
But if you see something that says, you can go on Amazon, I shouldn't name any brands, but you can go on the internet and get like a VOC monitor. It will not detect this. So like chemical class, it's a VOC, but not in like what you would think of in terms of like, I'll get a VOC monitor for my room. It won't pick, it will not pick these particular chemicals up. There's only one detection system, and it's really built to go in a factory. It's like thousands of dollars and the size of a suitcase, and needs this cartridge that you have to replace every month. So it's not really a viable thing for consumers right now.
Well, I think that what you're offering is a different side of the conversation that doesn't often get heard. And, because like I said, a lot of the environmental factors that are considered are like allergies to pets, so dander, pollen allergies, allergic to different chemicals in your detergents and cleaning supplies and things, and food allergies. But what you're talking about is something that is, I think some people do have sincere concern about, but they don't have any real proof. And I know you're working on this, which is really exciting, because I think it will help people, not like you said, not just now, but in the future, make better choices. And hopefully it will guide some of the decisions at a higher level than the normal citizen of like, should we even be using this? Like, do we have to do something to potentially control for this particular chemical in our environment?
Yeah, and I don't know anybody who works in that field in terms of the chemical companies, but I will give them partial credit for this. we didn't see a lot of denialism when you look through the literature on like, hey, look, this can cause problems in the lungs. It wasn't like cigarette companies where they started lying and hiding things. So, now it's very clear. If you want to use this, you're supposed to use a mask and head to toe. Now, does every worker actually do that? No, but you can't, if you're using it inappropriately, I don't know how much more you can ask of the companies. But I think, I hope that these chemical companies would engage with this, because in our data, it showed that there's two different things that show up in the EPA database. It's whether these are just released out in the wild, like on the first, like this is called like fugitive. So it's like if you burned it in your garage or your driveway, versus something called stack, which is a chimney, which if you think of like a cartoon picture of a factory in your head, you probably envision a chimney, right? That comes up. The stacks weren't associated. So it might be that what we really need is to just make sure anybody who's using this pumps it out of a stack, which dissipates it in a different way, or that maybe they need a particular filter when it's, to help deactivate it before it comes out. Like, I think there's probably a way in which we can mitigate this at the source that won't necessarily require, across the board bans or anything like that. We'll see. I guess, but to your larger point of, getting at this a different way, I agree. I was, struck, and it was very nice to see that, people at the expo, which was, overwhelmingly patients or caregivers, seemed to respond very favorably to this conversation. Because again, I think deep down, I think maybe patients intrinsically know that they don't have a drug deficiency, right? Their kid do not have a steroid deficiency that can be treated. There is such a thing as steroid deficiency. It's called Addison's disease, but it doesn't manifest as eczema
Right.
at all. So you're saying I don't have this problem because I lack this drug. Something else is going wrong. And I think early in eczema research, the thought was, it's all going to be genetic, and so you're just genetically broken or something like that, and that just has not panned out at all in any way. So there are a few monogenic versions, but those are super rare. So the really issue is like something is out there driving this. Something is causing this in my community. Something is causing this to be a flare, and whatever it is, it feels like people aren't really looking for it. And so, yeah, I do think that that's what people appreciated, that it does feel like, there's got to be something, because all the other stuff, dander, and we actually did a project where we looked at lotions under the thought that, okay, maybe all of a sudden we started using soaps that cause a problem, and we can find soaps that are bad. In terms of like, you see the soaps that love to brag, oh, we kill 99% of organisms, and you're like, well, okay, is the bad guy the part of the 1% that survives? Because that's a really big difference. If Staph aureus is the 1% that survives, there's part of the 99% that gets killed. And we can find soaps that represent both of those, versions. But then you step back and you're like, okay, it's not a soap. Like if it was one soap or one ingredient of a soap, I feel like this community would have pieced together by now, like, let's just avoid these things. This is obviously a problem. And soaps didn't get invented in 1970, and like dogs and cats didn't suddenly come into the home in 1970. So like all of these exposures that typically get blamed for skin reactions, you're like, I need you to, putting it into the larger picture. Okay, well, would that help you explain why this has suddenly become such a more modern phenomenon, or is it industrial only society problem, basically?
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this. And I'm excited to continue following your work and your research. I think, I honestly was so grateful to have, I didn't know who you were before I saw your name, and you got up on stage and started speaking. And I was like, I have a feeling I am going to deeply appreciate what this man is about to share. And it was one of the best talks and discussions of the entire conference. So I'm so grateful for you making the time to be here. So hopefully we can have you back sometime and dive into other topics, because I always love different perspectives on things. And I think you're right. People have that inkling that there's more to this than just a drug deficiency of some sort. And I think we need to give voices to those different perspectives, because there is something else more to this than just, your genes or your laundry detergent.
Yeah, I'll leave with the in the talk I'd mentioned, I didn't want to leave it out, the groundwater hypothesis, or the groundwater approach, which actually comes from social justice conversations. But the crux of it is, if you came across a lake and there was one fish floating dead in the lake or two fish floating dead in the lake, you would say, what's wrong with those guys, right? But if you come up to a lake and 30% of the fish are floating dead, you're saying there's something wrong with the lake and I'm not getting in. And I think when we look around and we see this much burden of eczema and skin disease and immune disease, it's becoming obvious there's something wrong with the lake. And we haven't spent a lot of time looking at that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. I'll make sure that we'll include your email address since you did say you work at the NIH, and so you have a public email address that people can contact you at. And I know we have doctors and other practitioners that listen who may also be equally interested in your research as well. So I'm just so appreciative for you to be here, and I hope that I'll be able to get you to come back sometime.
Sure. Yep, sounds good.
I am so grateful to have had Dr. Myles on the show, and I look forward to having him back. As you can see, this is why his presentation at the Eczema Expo was so incredibly popular and filled to the brim, because this information is what we're all looking for. Answers that explain this huge gap in knowledge of saying we don't know why you have these issues. And here we have this amazing doctor who's looking deeper into this connection and sharing something from a totally unique perspective, which I love and find absolutely fascinating. So if you have loved this episode and you found this really eye-opening, please make a point to share this with other eczema warriors out there. And while those of you listening who may not have eczema but have some other skin condition, it's not to say that this issue with this particular chemical isn't a problem for other skin conditions. We just don't currently have the research to show that it's not. So there may be, and there likely is, research coming down the pipeline in the years to come, hopefully sooner rather than later. But let's keep in mind that a lot of research does show an association between air quality and the severity of rashes in various skin conditions. So I think it's something worthwhile to keep on the back burner of something that could be a factor for you. So if you'd like to check out the research that we're talking about, you can head on over to skinterrupt.com/279, and you can find all the links for everything that we've discussed there. And you can leave your questions and comments so we can keep the conversation going. And make sure to rate and review the Healthy Skin Show if you haven't done so yet, and then hit the subscribe button. That way you never miss a weekly dose of research just like this, as well as alternative strategies, tips, and clinical pearls that we can share with you here on the show to help you rebuild healthy skin. And let's connect over on social media. I'm at Jennifer Fugo. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I look forward to diving deeper with you in the next episode.